Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thanks for joining me here today on this Friday to talk about what IBM is doing with decentralized identity as part of the Digital Chamber of Commerce parallel booth that we have here at IBM. So my name is Milan Patel. I'm a product manager within the IBM Security Business Unit. And in today's session for the next 30 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about decentralized identity and how IBM is participating and providing experiences around the space. The agenda here is pretty straightforward. We'll talk about some of the challenges, the value of decentralized identity in the context of the broader identity problem that we're looking to solve, as well as showing you a live demo and then just giving a view on where we're planning to take decentralized identity from an enterprise grade solution standpoint. So with that, I'm accompanied here with my fellow colleague, Jeff, who's going to be monitoring the chat. So please ask any questions that you may have, and hope you enjoy the session. So we'll get started. So as we think about identity, and as we think about what trust is and how we establish trust, one of the things that I like to start off with is putting into context, right? How do you prove that you are who you are, and what is identity at the end of the day, right? If we dissect that a little bit further, we have different definitions and perspectives of identity, right? Depending on the medium of which we exchange it from. For example, if we think about identity in the real world, so when I mean real world, I mean our physical interactions, physical world interactions. Identity is more in the context of, what do I have in my wallet? What are metadata representations of who I am? And how do I establish and exchange those interactions or those attributes to establish trust, right? So in the physical world, we have a physical wallet or purse. When we buy those physical wallets and purses from stores, vendors, right? They don't come primed with any credentials in them. We actually have to go obtain those credentials based on the relationships that we have, right? So whether that's, driving to the DMV and getting a driver's license, or going to a bank account, opening up a bank account and getting a bank credential. All these are in the context of us storing and managing our own credentials. If we want to throw away the wallet or purse that we bought and replace another one, it's interoperable. And it doesn't matter what reader or what things someone uses to issue a credential to our physical as a physical rendering, and then who we present it to as a verifier in a physical rendering. It's all interoperable and we can use it, right? The credentials aren't tied to a specific interaction flow, right? They're diverse and can be used interchangeably, all dependent on the business policy of a verifier, right? So if you think about that level of interaction that we've been doing this for thousands of years in the physical world, right? We have wallets, we have storage mechanisms, we store it, and then we present credentials in that context. All those interactions are peer-to-peer, issuer to holder, holder to verifier, right? There's no circumvent between an issuer and a verifier. It all goes directly in the control of the end user. Okay, so that's the physical medium. Now let's navigate to the digital medium. So people tend to think of identity in the digital medium as not metadata representations of who we are, but more so in the context of what we have access to and what accounts we have, right? And there's a challenge with that, right? Because identity in the physical world is more of credentials, attributes that I have, that I store and manage, that I control. Identity on the internet is inundation with username and passwords that I then have point-to-point relationships with in terms of accessing various resources. The point there is identity on the internet or the internet in general was built without that layer of identity that we're accustomed to. and being able to exchange it in a portable, user-controlled, privacy-aware way, right? So that's to put some of the context around, what is identity and how do you prove who you are? Now, when we look at it in the context of the models that we have today, right? So today's models are centralized federated models, right? There's really three personas in the picture, right? You have issuers who in the digital world are known as identity providers. You have holders who are known as users, and then you have verifiers who are known as relying parties, right? So in the centralized federated model, you have issuers that provide an identity to holders in a rendering of a username and password, right? So you'll get something either in an email or you're creating an account, right? And then now holders have to, memorize it or use it in their, or use it like a password, one password vault or whatever the case may be, and use that as the form of establishing trust on the internet. Those username and passwords, though, are very specific to the point-to-point integrations that relying parties depend on, right? For example, you can't, if I went to my bank account, I probably couldn't use Facebook because it's not equipped for that, right? Nor is it trusted. So in this context, holders have to present credentials or username and passwords to verifiers and then have to have that integration back to issuers, right? So the challenges here indicate of lack of portability, right? So users are now inundated with username and passwords. The verifier must phone home, right? So now there's this big brother type of mentality of identity providers knowing what identities are being used for and who the holder has relationships with. And that's, again, in the notion of how do we get more robust and have a better posture from a security privacy standpoint. And then the last thing is the holder may have to disclose more information than required. And that sort of creates some of the challenges in the context of, centralized federated models, right? This is sort of the world that we exist today. Now, we've done, we've done identity for a while, right? We've moved from centralized models to federated models, moving into decentralized identity. But one of the key things that I want to make, that I want to accentuate here is, every time we think about identity, it's always in the context of standards, right? Standards are critical because to be able to do identity, which is a horizontal foundation to anything and everything that we do, it's got to be something that's interoperable. And it's important that we base everything that we do, regardless of what evolution we put it on, it has to be rooted in standards, right? So when we think about centralized models, this is where you had very one-to-one point relationships, right? There were standards to ensure the security of that account interaction and presentment of username and passwords. We've since then, we haven't necessarily completely addressed it, but we've introduced a better experience, right? So instead of going from thousands of passwords, we now limit it to maybe hundreds of passwords in the notion of federation, right? So using SAML, OpenID Connect, or OAuth, we've introduced this notion of federated identity, but this still requires you to have that, identity provider create you account. It's only portable to those identity providers that relying parties have integrated with, and you're still inundated with the username and password, right? So there's still a callback, but we've shifted the user's portability a little bit, right? Not drastically enough to then say, hey, I can use it wherever, but it's in the step in the right direction. And then we've now introducing decentralized identity, right? Which is the point-to-point interaction. And this is where standards like DIDs, decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, decentralized key management, are standards that we base this new model of identity off of, right? And the big point here is we're shifting some of the control, we're improving the experience, but all in the context of basing everything that we do on open standards, right? And industry adopted standards. Now, what does a decentralized identity trust model look like, right? So bringing that picture from the centralized and federated model, overlaying what a decentralized identity trust model looks like, we see a few things, right? The roles and the personas are still the same. We still have issuers issuing credentials to holders, holders presenting and delivering those credentials to verifiers. But what we've introduced here, and again, I say this more as this is an enabler. This is not the be all end all, right? That enables that is decentralized identity. It's an enabler to decentralized identity. But distributed ledger technology provides the ability to do decentralized PKI. So the analogy here is just like how the internet uses DNS to resolve domain names, right? As you start issuing and verifying credentials, the ledger here is used to do decentralized PKI, such that you don't have a central point of failure or a central authority that owns the management of public keys. And I say public keys and corresponding decentralized identity metadata artifacts. I say that because there's no PII that ever goes on the ledger. So as we walk through this flow, we have issuer on the left, right? The issuer could be a DMV, or it could be some, organization that is trusted, that is issuing, credentials. The big thing that I want to point out here as well is system of records don't go away, right? Issuers are still going to have their system of record. What they're going to do though is, as part of issuing a credential, they're going to issue a asymmetric public key pair. They're going to create one. They're going to put a public key on a ledger, and then they're going to keep their asymmetric private key. They're going to sign attestations with their private key and deliver them to holders in their digital wallet. Now the holder is storing and controlling the credentials, right? Those are attestations from the issuer. Now the holder can present that to whichever verifier they want. So as long as the holder meets the verifier's business policy. Point in case example, you can't use a library card to onboard with TSA or go through TSA checkpoint, right? You have to use a driver's license or a passport or any other approved credential. Now, as the holder presents that credential, the verifier consumes that credential based on the attributes that are needed to establish trust, and then checks the validity that it came from an issuer that they trust by fetching the public key of that issuer, right? So now there's no callback. So 3 aspects that are enhanced, right? And I want to say enhanced because it's not a total rip and replace. It's an enhancement because this is a new way of doing identity, just like how we moved from SAML to OpenID Connect. This is an evolution of identity. The first thing is distributedness, right? There's no single point of failure. There's no centralized CA. The nodes, the ledger that is used to facilitate decentralized PKI is distributed, right? So if one node goes down, there's still other nodes where that can still enable the interaction flows that I just mentioned. The second is no callback, right? So now verifiers never go back to issuers. They go through a distributed ledger utility, which is the way that they ensure the trust as part of a verification process. Again, the big thing is no PII ever goes on the ledger. It's just decentralizing PKI. And then the third aspect is selective disclosure, right? Now the user has the granularity of what to present as part of a verification interaction in the accordance of a verifier's business policy. So it's important that we know those 3 enhancements. There's other ones, but these are the 3 main ones as we look to evolve how we do identity in the context of establishing trust. Now, what makes this happen? So the first thing is we talked about the ledger, right? So this is an enterprise utility, right? Think of this as a stack as I'm going to go across this, right? The utility serves as how we anchor, public keys and how we manage those public keys. The second is a secure messaging protocol. How do we establish connections, even though someone may be using different vendors or different technologies, right? It's around a standardized approach of being able to do secure messaging. The third is around a common data format, schemas. How do we make these schemas something that we use in the context of, sorry, my slides are a little bit getting away from me, but how do we use the schemas to establish trust, right? Like a common data format, like a common DMV credential or driver's license credential or a healthcare credential or whatever you name it, right? There needs to be a common data format. And then the fourth is around ecosystem trust, right? So this is more the business and legal components to stitch everything together as part of an entire stack, right? So when we think about this stack, it's really enabling a digital trust marketplace, right? As these layers that really create this new evolving trust model, right? And as part of that, something that we've done with something that IBM has done with the community in collaboration with other organizations is creation of this Trust over IP Foundation, right? The notion of Trust over IP is to provide a recipe book, a reference architecture, a referenceable, repeatable approach to how we build this notion of, and what luminaries call in the industry, transitive trust, right? And the purpose of Trust over IP is not to say thou shalt do this, but more so giving the guardrails as ecosystems, as consortiums, as these governance frameworks, as technology stacks mature, to provide it context at each layer. So as we step through the Trust over IP layer, and as I referenced in that diagram before, you have utilities, right? Utilities are in the context of who's going to govern them? What are the requirements from a technical standpoint in node sizes, right? What is the geo distribution of those utilities? Can they be on multiple clouds? Is one cloud does not work because then that creates a central point of failure, et cetera, right? So you can think about that in that context. Then we move up, okay, now as part of a ecosystem that we're looking to create, what vendors are we going to support and what are some of the standards that we want to implement so that at layer 2, we have interoperability based on the use cases, the needs that we're looking to address. Layer 3 is around how do we create a standard set of schemas that the ecosystem and ecosystem members can use as they start issuing and verifying credentials. And then layer 4 is more around okay, what are the business and legal aspects to really bring this together, as I mentioned, right? So Trust over IP is again, it's a foundation within the Linux Foundation. Its goal is to provide guidance and transparency to build at each layer of a decentralized identity stack. There's a technical component to it. There's a governance component to it. They are married inextricably together because it requires the ability to bring that into context, right, from a business and legal standpoint in parallel with the technology, right? Everything that we do from a Trust over IP standpoint and the backing of Trust over IP standpoint is rooted in open standards and interoperability. So you'll see things around, as I mentioned earlier, DIDs and verifiable credentials, which are rooted in the world W3C specifications. So there's a specification for DIDs, there's a specification for verifiable credentials. OASIS is decentralized key management, right? So those are the set of standards being developed in the open as part of those elements related to decentralized identity. Then there's designs, right? The design for DID communication, the design for various architectures of agents and other things, right? That's being designed as part of, DIF being one organization and Hyperledger being another, right? And then there's also code aspects, right? So when we think about, and we'll get into some of the things that we're doing from an IBM perspective with identity in terms of the open source, but like things like Hyperledger Indy and Hyperledger Aries as part of code that's being built out in the open to be able to build on this stack, right? And leverage the stack. Now, I will also mention, Trust over IP is technology agnostic, right? So I mentioned Hyperledger Indy and Aries. Those are just technology protocol overlays that can be placed on top of Trust over IP. But at the end of the day, Trust over IP is agnostic of any technology. Again, it's more of a reference. It's a repeatable architecture that can be used to route conversations and building out decentralized identity experiences. So what is IBM doing then in the context of the open source, right? So I mentioned Hyperledger, right, as some of the open source protocols and code that we use. So Hyperledger Indy really maps to layer 1, right? The consumable utilities, and that's what we use as part of the ledger components for decentralized PKI as part of key exchanges and ensuring the resolution of those DIDs as part of a credential exchange experience using decentralized identity. The second thing is around project is around Hyperledger Aries, right? So think of this as layer 2 and layer 3. This is the secure peer-to-peer exchange of credentials, doing wallet key management, the secure protocols to establish trust, right? To establish those connections, right? That's Hyperledger Aries. And then Hyperledger Ursa, which is really the cryptography that is overlaid across a shared cryptographic library that's overlaid across, Hyperledger Indy and Aries that they use as a shared library, right? So these are, again, trust over IP technology agnostic. Our perspective is to overlay these in trust over IP, right? Part of this is to provide transparency in terms of what we do and how we then address and have a point of view at each layer of the stack. And this is, again, just something that we are advocating for. And others advocate similar things, others advocate different things, but at the end of the day, it's ensuring that we have transparency in what the market and what the community is doing at each layer. So that being said, we talked about decentralized identity, what it is, sort of the overall reference framework, what are some open source interoperable activities going on in the community. And now I want to just spend a few minutes on sort of what IBM does in the context of decentralized identity, right? So what we provide is this end-to-end experience, right? In being able to establish your nodes or run networks or utilities at layer 1 with our node as a service offering. And that's something that we provide in a beta, and being able to provide that value, right? So this is, again, tied to Indy. So we provide the ability to either spin up an Indy network or be one Indy node as part of a network, and we provide node as a service capabilities, again, all building on top of the open source. And that's at layer 1, right? Layer 2 and 3, we provide a full end-to-end credential exchange experience. This is in a offering preview right now, but what we provide here is the ability to spin up wallets as a service, right? And be able to perform the flows to issue a credential, to hold and manage a credential, and to verify a credential, and to enable developer time to value with a open source SDK and a set of samples to base off of to get started. We also provide credential managers for, being able to manage credentials on your device, on your phone or tablet, as well as being able to manage credentials on your desktop through a browser extension. The technology preview is free. If you're interested, reach out to me. But what I want to get into now is the demo of that technology preview. So if you give me a second as I navigate my screens, you can see my phone on the right, and on the left is my browser. So what I'm going to do in this demo is, and do a little bit of a demo God sacrifice here to ensure that it goes well. This is going to be a live demo. So the use case that I'm going to show you is I, as an end user, am going to get a government credential, and I'm going to get an employment credential delivered to me in my digital wallet. And I'm going to use both of those credentials to establish trust with an entity that I have zero relationship with. The two things that I want to ensure that we take away from this is, one, the usability, the ease of use in getting digital credentials, as well as the onboarding to a new experience, right? So passwordless onboarding is something that we talk about, as well as the transparency and the control that the end user then has, right? So, we get asked all the time, how is this beneficial for an organization? Well, it's all about providing frictionless yet trustworthy experiences. And this is where we get into the notions of like passwordless onboarding to be able to acquire and maintain relationships with your end users. So that being said, on my right is my mobile device. And my mobile device, I have my wallet. And in my wallet, I've got one credential. This is an older credential that I got, last year from Mycelia. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to obtain, a government credential, an HR credential, and use that to establish trust with a credit union, right? So this is my mobile wallet. There's different ways I can interact with folks and do other things. So let's get to it. So I've got 3 apps here, web apps. I got a government app, an HR app, and a credit union app. So what I'm going to do, and again, the experiences I'm showing you here are just the purpose of the demo, but you can imagine me as an individual going into a DMV office and getting a digital credential, right? The experience here is more so, hey, the DMV and your employer start issuing digital credentials. You just got to log into your profile to get that credential, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to log in to my DMV portal. You can see that, I've got all the things that are needed as part of my identity, right? And then what the DMV has as part of the system of record, right, that they have about me. And they can now enable this experience that says, hey, we now offer a digital version of your driver's license. So let me issue that. So they're going to issue me a digital credential. It's going to kick off a workflow, right, where it's going to send me a request on my device. Notice how I got a notification say that DMV wants to create a connection with you. Also notice that on my browser, I got a pop-up notification because I have an extension. So depending on what's easier, I can select either one. So I'm going to accept that connection from the DMV. And then they're going to issue me a digital credential. Again, notice on the left, I get a pop-up on my browser extension, but I also get the DMV saying they want to issue me this credential. So I can scan it, review it for a little bit, and then click OK. So now I have a government issued driver's license. And by the way, this is a sample scenario. So I have that driver's license. And as I introspect that driver's license, you can see that it's exactly what the DMV has in their system of record about me, right, as part of attestations. And all the attributes associated with my, credential that they issued. Now, each of these are signed, right, by their private key. So as I have the granularity of selecting what I want to share with other folks, they have that. The other thing I want to point out is there's a physical card rendering. This is important because it's important to have coexistence, right? So if I go into, TSA, or if there's a scanner, I can present this, scan the barcode, right? And it'll allow the verifier at the end to be able to then, extract the details that are needed as part of that interaction, right? So it's important that we enable those types of experiences as well, right? Because now we're blurring how we do identity in the physical world and in the digital world in a common way through this verifiable credentials approach, right? So this is the government credential. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a employment credential. So again, I work at IBM. They say, hey, we now issue employee credentials, and just log into your portal, right? And we now have an experience that allows you to do that. So I'm going to click issue credential, and they're going to issue me a credential. Same workflow gets kicked off. IBM is going to say, do you want to accept a connection? I'm going to click OK. And then they're going to say, do you want this credential now? Notice the flow. Before I can get a credential, I have to accept the connection. The connection creates this peer-to-peer relationship, right? That I now have a tunnel to talk to someone as part of that interaction. So now I've got my employment credential. Same thing. It's got a physical rendering. It's got a scanner if I need to scan, and then the associated attributes associated with the credential that I just received from my employer. Okay. So nothing too earth-shattering or revolutionary just yet. All I did was just obtain the digital wallet and obtain the credentials, right, that I have with relationships. The next thing that I'm going to do now is I'm going to passwordlessly, as if that's a word, or ID-lessly, or without typing, I'm going to establish trust with a credit union that I have zero relationship with. what's going to happen and what you're going to see here is I'm going to then use the credentials that I have in my wallet to establish trust. So I want to sign up for an account, and I'm going to use a mobile app. And then I'm going to say, okay, I want to sign up for an account. As part of that verification policy that they have, they're going to say you need a driver's license and proof of employment. So luckily we have that. They're then going to render a QR code that's going to initiate an interaction, right? They're basically giving me an idea of what their end URL, their wallet address is. And I'm basically going to scan that and kick off an interaction. And I have to confirm that I want to do this interaction. So I'm going to click OK. And then that's going to kick off a flow. So what's happening now is the credit union is going to send me a request to interact with them. And they're going to first look to, they're first going to look to, process a proof request, which is now the credit union wants to verify who I am, right? So I'm going to give them the credentials that they're looking for. And notice how these credentials are coming from two different issuers, right? So it's a compounded credential associated with the attributes. I have transparency in what I'm going to share, and I click OK. So what's happening here is now I'm going to I'm going to present these credentials to the credit union. And the credit union is basically going to verify the credentials that I'm providing them and then fetch the public keys of both the employer and the DMV to validate that it's coming from issuers that they trust and that the credentials haven't been revoked. They're not going back to the DMV and the employer. They're going to the ledger, which has the metadata that indicates and gives them the verification and validation that these are still valid credentials, right? So as that's happening, it's generating that proof and sending this data to the credit union, right? So all that's happening in this background, and as we're setting that credential. The other thing that the credit union is going to do after they've established trust is they're then going to issue me a credit union credential. So I'm going to go to my pending requests and accept a credit union credential and click OK. So now they're just like how you go to the physical branch and you present your identity and they give you a card, right? Same interaction that we just showed here digitally, right? So I didn't type in anything. I used the credentials that I had in my wallet that I controlled, and I presented these in the context of the relationship that I was looking to establish trust with. So now I'm going to log out, and we just did passwordless onboarding, and something that already exists in the identity world today is passwordless authentication. And we can use decentralized identity as a mechanism for that, right? But again, the biggest thing that I wanted to highlight is this notion of passwordless onboarding, that you can use digital credentials to establish trust, right? So now as I come back in, I already have an existing relationship. It's then gonna send a proof request, and notice how I just have to present the account number attribute within my bank credential, right? And that then allows me to establish trust with the credit union. And that's going to be sending. And once that verification is done, I should be in and accessing my account. Other thing I want to notice here is notice how you can see what I've shared and with whom I've shared it with. So this gives the user transparency in all the credentials that they've been sharing and presenting as part of the interactions that they have. So with that, I wanted to just conclude with saying, currently we're in a technology preview. What I showed, folks can have access to. If you want to just drop me an email or ask in the chat, we can get you details to get started. But at the end of the day, it's all about providing enterprise-grade decentralized identity. But decentralized identity isn't its own thing, right? It's an extension to how we evolve enterprise IAM and consumer IAM. And because of that, that's the reason why we're delivering and building this in the context of IBM Security Verify, which is IBM's identity as a service offering. And it's experiences that we're looking to enable to provide the ability to extend and evolve and a digital trust practice that enterprises provide for their employees as well as the consumers, as well as Internet of Thing devices. So that's something that we're looking to build as part of our vision, and it's in the context of providing a comprehensive digital trust platform within what we have from an IBM perspective in IBM Security Verify. So with that, thank you for taking the time, and hope you enjoyed this session, and we'll be answering any of the questions that you have in the channel. Thank you, and have a good weekend.